So I've now seen our speaker present her work twice, most recently at a conference in Munich this past March, where she is one of the keynotes and also generously gave feedback to early doctoral students on their work. And things are still kind of new to me, but it seemed clear that she's a very different sort of researcher. Her enthusiasm for the learning sciences and her work are palpable. I asked her in Germany if she wanted to speak at Rutgers, and immediately she said, "I'd love to." Dr. Carolyn is an associate professor of language technologies and human-computer interaction in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research program is focused on better understanding the social and pragmatic nature of conversation, and using this understanding to build computational systems that can improve the efficacy of conversation between people and between people and computers. In order to pursue these goals, she invokes approaches from computational discourse analysis and text mining, conversational agents, and computer-supported collaborative learning. She serves as president of the International Society of the Learning Sciences. She also serves as associate editor of the International Journal of Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning and the IEEE Transactions on Learning Technologies. Additionally, she supervises, like 12 graduate students and a postdoc. So this is a very busy person, and we're very pleased to have her here at Rutgers.
Thank you very much, and hi, Janice out there. I'm really, really pleased to be here. I'll be here the whole day, and I'm at your disposal, so I hope we'll have lots of discussions throughout the day. So I've entitled my talk From Discourse Analytics to Design, because I'm going to talk to you about a design methodology that's very data-driven. But as I was talking to Randy about, I also am very skeptical about all of the kinds of modeling that we use and apply to language, because language is so intricate, so beautiful, and we lose so much of that structure when we apply these modeling technologies. And so we have to have a certain amount of skepticism about the results from our work. So first, let me just acknowledge my team, as Randy has also mentioned, and of course, this work would not be possible without all of their hard work. So I mentioned that this view of language that I would like to be able to convey, and how it is that I think that it allows us to have an appropriate level of skepticism. And so if I convince you of nothing else by the end of my talk, I hope that you'll come out thinking, wow, I really want to learn more about language. I want to read more about linguistics. I want to dig into what the behavioral sciences have to tell me about language and how it works, because I know that I can't really leverage the view of learners and learning that come from this language without knowing more about it. Because I think the biggest weakness in the work in discourse analytics that's out there today is that technology is used in a way that's a little bit too flippant, and I want to try to engender a little bit more questioning and thought about what can we really leverage, what are we really getting at. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about an approach to doing discourse analytics that sort of builds on what we know from the behavioral sciences. Then I'm going to talk about how some of those analytics have been focused recently in analysis of data from massive open online courses, or MOOCs, specifically for the purpose of understanding when and a little bit about why students drop out of these courses. And that has been used to motivate design of some interventions that we have tested already in MOOCs and that we're continuing to refine over time. And then I'm going to focus on team projects in MOOCs. How can we support them? Why are they not working well now? So what can we learn from our analysis and modeling of data that would inform how we might do a better job of supporting this kind of collaborative learning in a MOOC context? And now I'll finish with some resources and partnership opportunities. Okay, so the research that my group does, it starts with data that's collected in realistic learning settings. And for years and years, we were doing work in classroom contexts, and more recently, we've started to do research in MOOCs, as I mentioned. And most of my team is composed of computational linguists. And so for us, the data that's most interesting and most important, and I realize it sort of creates this little myopia in my approach to studying learning, is transcripts from discussions that are collected in various ways in learning settings. So For example, it might be chat sessions from collaborative reflection that students might have done, or it might be messages sent back and forth over a semester in a project course. And what we do is we first take what can be leveraged from research in linguistics and sociolinguistics, also discourse analysis, but social psychology as well, and we try to formalize those findings and apply them through computational techniques to the data. And we use that to try to evaluate whether our interventions have been successful, have we supported better processes, and how do those processes connect with the outcomes that we care about. And with the findings that we have gained, we have informed the development of interventions like these computer-supported collaborative learning interventions that we've been publishing about, where students may be sitting at their own computer. They have a view of a shared, sometimes whiteboard space, where they get some instruction or can pass back and forth some images of the work that they're working on together in this distributed fashion. But then there's also a chat where the students are communicating through natural language, but in text. And in that context, we can offer support in the form of the participation of intelligent conversational agents that act as though they're, another participant in the conversation, sometimes taking a teacher role, sometimes just structuring the task, other times posing as students. But let me just say, we don't try to convince people that these agents are human, but they just take on different roles in that conversation. And we evaluate the kinds of support triggered by automated analyses in real time of the collaboration that's going on in classroom settings, and we have a series of positive results. And more recently, we've also been looking at the connection between what happens during those focused collaborative activities and the whole class situation outside of those activities. And what we find is that when students have had the experience of working together in small collaborative groups in a successful way, that has a positive impact also in a whole class setting in their interaction with their teacher. And we're really excited about the possibilities that that offers also for teacher professional development. But as I look out, especially as the field of discourse analytics and learning analytics in general has been on the rise, and big data sets with conversational data that people are interested in looking at and understanding from the standpoint of why do people stay in or drop out of MOOCs, what is their experience in those contexts, how are they learning, are they learning? I see some tendencies that I used to see in an area that I worked in before I even got into collaborative learning, and that was tutorial dialogue. And in those days, we tried to understand interactions between tutors and students, and there was a lot of work at a certain stage where we adopted very simplistic counting methods to analyze those interactions and to try to make predictions about learning in those contexts. And we looked at sort of general indicators of interactivity or turn length in particular, trying to investigate the conditions under which students would utter longer turns. How many questions were students asking? What was the ratio of student talk to tutor talk? Or was students taking initiative in the conversation to drive the direction that it would take? And these things can be identified fairly reliably with pretty easy computational technology, and you can always come up with a story for why these things should make a prediction about learning. And there were many papers published where, for an individual study, there was a correlation found that could be explained and connected to some theoretical idea. And yet what we found was that these patterns didn't generalize from one story to the next, where there would always be something to be said about the discussions that occurred in different studies. We didn't find reliable patterns that happened over and over again. And we started to realize that these shallow features, these easy to compute indicators, they probably correlated with important things about the discussion, but they weren't themselves the important thing about the discussion. And so that motivated looking deeper into what's known about categories of talk and how they connect with processes, both cognitive and social, and how those processes connect with learning. And so we start with ideas of interaction that come really out of the field of psychology, and we even focus, I would say, a little bit more on social psychology than cognitive psychology, because what we want to understand is, how does social positioning work what's happening in a team when people are relating to one another. What are they trying to achieve through the conversation about their coordination, about their solidarity, about their relationships, about their mutual respect that underlies the collaboration that they're doing. Layered on top of that, you can see in work in sociolinguistics, though it's of a very different style and nature, it refers to a lot of these basic processes that you can see in the psychology literature, but the focus is on how are these processes reflected through language choices that people make. And so there's a way in which this research informs how we might look for clues of what's going on in at this more invisible layer through those language choices. They're just clues though, and there's an acknowledgement that we're not really seeing those processes per se, but at least there's deep thought about how the processes connect with the language choices. And so I would argue that if the modeling that we do is built on those insights, and if we use them, and even though they challenge us and they're difficult to get our heads around and to really fully capture in any computational model, but if we can have our modeling be informed by those findings, we're more likely to develop tools that will generalize, that will tell us something in an effective way about the processes that we care about. And so we will be in a much better position to understand the data that we have. And using this methodology, we have developed a number of process and state measures that have been published in our prior work, and I'll be happy to pass on and discuss any of this work with you outside of this talk. Of course, in a 45-minute talk, I can't cover all these things. But in addition to working on the measurement aspect, how can we get at some of these things like help exchange or collaborative knowledge construction, attitude, or social connection? Then we've also looked at how these process and state measures connect with outcomes that we care about. And now we're trying to look more for, do we see some generalizable things, or how do these connections change across context, and how are they sensitive to variables that we might not see in the conversation itself? So one way that we have kind of boiled down some dimensions that we're really interested in conversation is through a framework that we refer to as souffle. And the reason for choosing a name like that is because we've drawn very heavily from systemic functional linguistics in our characterization of language choices and how they help us to get a handle on the social processes that support the kind of exchange that's really important from a cognitive perspective. So in our three-dimensional coding scheme, at the heart of what we really care about is something that you can find in virtually every framework for analyzing what's important about collaborative discourse. And that is about argumentation, how students display their reasoning to one another, and also how they build on each other's ideas. And so there's a value of articulation of reasoning that builds on and operates on the reasoning and mental models of other students. And so we've taken a framework from Berkowitz and Gibbs called transactivity, which has been represented and re-represented under various different names in a variety of different people's work. But we've boiled it down to a definition that we can get good reliability on and that we've had some success at computationalizing. And that's what we believe is the most important activity in these collaborative exchanges that connects directly to learning. But we've looked at some other dimensions that support that exchange. And so we've sort of boiled it down in this social space to a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. So the horizontal axis is about showing openness. To what extent are you inviting in the ideas of another student? So acknowledging that your mental model is exactly that. It's how you see the world, but that others may see that differently. And that opens up a space in which horizontally students can move towards each other into a place where they can have this transactive exchange. But there's also the vertical dimension that's more reflective of power balance, and how is that reflected in how students position themselves as being the source of knowledge within these knowledge exchanges. And so what we find is that if there's too much of an imbalance, it also doesn't lend itself to this kind of transactive exchange, because the flow of information will will tend to be in one direction, but we want that flow to occur in both directions, just as we want a balance of assimilation and accommodation within a learning setting. And so we have not found direct connections, although in some studies we do find correlations between these social constructs and learning, but not in a generalizable way. And we believe it's because they don't directly influence the learning that students do, but what they do is they position students in a place where they can engage in the behaviors that are cognitively valuable and that connect directly with their cognitive learning processes. So I'm going to focus a little bit on this construct of transactive knowledge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about techniques that we've used to be able to model that in language, because what you'll see in the techniques that have worked is some way of acknowledging how dependent this exchange is on the social environment that supports the students being positioned properly to engage in this. So first, the simple definition of transactivity. We want to see students expressing their reasoning. So here a student is talking about a model of a cell and saying, I think the tube will get heavier because water is going in. They're dealing with semi-permeable membranes. And then the second student is building on or operating on that other student's reasoning by first acknowledging an agreement, but then extending it. So that's true, but the important point is that water can flow in, but starch can't flow out. So elaborating and making more complete the idea that the first student mentioned. And there are lots of different ways that students can build on and operate on each other's reasoning. This is only just one example. But if you look at the history of how this idea has been discussed and represented in the literature, beginning with Piaget and his discussion of power balance and cognitive conflict, and how there should be a balance between two students or a student and some external stimulus in order to create the conditions under which cognitive conflict is likely to occur. And this idea that these transactive exchanges represent opportunities where this cognitive conflict could occur, because there's a comparison of mental models that gives the opportunity to identify a gap in one's own mental model. And so these kinds of transactive exchanges have sometimes been referred to as socio-cognitive conflict. Not that they themselves are cognitive conflict, but they give evidence that there was an opportunity for it to occur. In some later work, we see directly address the connection between transactivity itself, as represented in conversations, and power balance. And then more recently, a connection between transactivity and friendship, which is also related to this idea of power balance, where we see that in friend pairs, students engage in more of this transactive exchange because there's more mutual respect, more of a tendency to have that balance of assimilation and accommodation that lends itself to this kind of socio-cognitive conflict that we observe through language. Now, with that understanding, we can think about what would be good clues, what would be good features that we could build into our machine learning models to help us to recognize where these transactive exchanges are taking place. So a pair of students from my lab, both of whom have graduated and moved on now, have worked together, one of them working on an unsupervised dynamic Bayes-net approach to apply to speech data to identify evidence that there was the right kind of social balance, that you see evidence that there was the mutual respect that you would expect to be associated with a balance of assimilation and accommodation. So how was that done? Well, if we think about the literature from sociolinguistics, there's a lot of focus on the idea of speech style accommodation and how you can see reflected either that people are at odds with one another or that they're trying to build solidarity with one another in terms of how there are either stylistic convergences or divergences in their speech, but which features are important in the movement that displays these social relationships is very contextual. It's not as though there are some features that their movement will always tell you something about the social relationship between people. It depends on how they identify themselves, what those features mean in terms of their identity. And so then if you can understand that in a very situated way, it's not that hard to find the evidence. But what's hard is that what would be that evidence is very difficult to find, because it's not going to be the same for every pair of students. It depends on how they identify themselves and each other within an interaction. And so what we did with our unsupervised modeling technique, which I'm really only going to describe at a very kind of high level, is that we built into the structure the idea of the kind of motion we would expect to see on the features that had some social significance. So what we would expect is that those features would exhibit a consistent motion over a period of time, that we would see shifts that were local, but we could distinguish the meaningful socially related shifts from those that were for other reasons in the language, based on how persistent the motion was. And if we build that assumption into the model, it's able in an unsupervised way from a corpus to identify those features that for a particular population are important for those kinds of social relationships, and then we're able to make a measurement based on how we see those styles being adopted or not over time, whether students are exhibiting the appropriate speech style accommodation. So this model, which does not require us to actually label something specific in the data ahead of time, it builds in kind of an understanding of what we expect based on the literature. And then we expect that the analysis that comes out is going to reflect something about those relationships between students. And we should be able to then validate that we are getting something like that out by seeing whether it predicts what we expect it to predict on the side of the language. So a second student took the same corpus that we trained our dynamic Bayes net over in order to identify speech style states that we could use as handles to measure this consistent motion of pronunciation style over time, and make a prediction from the transcripts, a hand annotated version where we looked at where we saw transactive knowledge exchanges between students in this corpus. And so the two students did their work first independently. So the work that the first student did on the audio data was not using the analysis of transactivity. And in the analysis of transactivity, the audio data was not included. And there was no sense in which the model of measuring the speech style accommodation was tuned in order to make any kind of prediction about the prevalence of transactivity. But what we did was we then took the measure that we got from the work that was purely just focused on trying to get a measure of speech style accommodation, and then we looked at how that one feature that was measured through this unsupervised model, where the only supervision was just expectations from the literature in sociolinguistics on speech style accommodation, would it correlate with prevalence of transactivity as analyzed in the transcripts? And what we found was, well, you wouldn't want to make your whole assessment of transactivity based only on this one feature, but that one feature by itself predicted the prevalence of transactivity with an R value of 0.4. So while that only gives us about 16% of the variance in the prevalence of transactivity, it's only one feature. And from the actual words that students have uttered, we can identify from the content and rhetorical strategies more of an accurate assessment. And yet it sort of confirms this idea that we can find connections between social processes and cognitive processes, and we can use that to inform our modeling, and that it's reliable in terms of making predictions that when we build them into our models make better models. Now, we've done a lot of work on modeling transactivity, mostly focused on text. So this was the one investigation where we based our prediction purely on audio data. So we actually had worked for a long time with Frank Fisher's group in Munich, using texts from a discussion board, so asynchronous communication between students in groups, that where also a coding scheme very much related to the idea of transactivity was applied to the data, and we were using machine learning to be able to make predictions. And what we found there was also related to this idea of looking at similarity between how texts were being presented from one student to the next. And so it was very important in our automated prediction of transactivity to put in a feature that talked about how cohesive a particular message was with the context of messages produced further up in the thread by students other than the one who had uttered the current post. So if there was a high cohesion, it was more likely the case that that was a transactive contribution, and that substantially improved the performance of applying a machine learning technique to predicting transactivity from these posts over approaches that purely just extracted features from individual texts and made a prediction of those individual texts for that post. We have a variety of other papers that are related to our investigations on other textual corpora for transactivity, but I'm not going to talk about those other approaches today. Okay, so what do we learn from this? What we learn from this is we can use modeling techniques to be able to measure this process that has been important in a variety of theories of learning. And it's a process that's very important for cognitive reasons, but it's supported by social aspects of the interaction. And we're going to see that play out in both of the studies that we talk about, but first we're going to talk about analysis of attrition in MOOCs. So there's been a lot of work on trying to identify the factors that make predictions about dropout over time in MOOCs, and some of our work has focused on making those predictions based on discussion forum data. And building off of this idea of transactivity, we've looked for, among other things, indicators of cognitive engagement in student participation in the discussion forums. So cognitive engagement might not necessarily be the same thing as transactivity. You can show that you are thinking deeply about material, that you are making inferences about the material, and you're very involved in it without actually it being a social thing. But transactive contributions are going to have that aspect of cognitive engagement as well. And so, so we felt that this was one component that we could get at and wouldn't require us to look as closely at the details of what students had said. So we were trying to get a sense of how students might be engaging in abstract thinking about material from their posts without actually thinking in very much detail about all of the ways that that might occur in this data that's very heterogeneous and messier than what we tend to deal with in classroom studies. And so we based our first cut at this analysis by thinking about how it's the case that in language, the abstractness of words is associated with the level at which students are engaging in showing their abstract thinking or generalizations that they're making. So when they are trying to make an inference based on content, they will tend to use more abstract words, but where they're sort of repeating material that they have read or just talking about observations that they have made, or even just the situation that they're in this course, they will tend to use more concrete words. Now, we realize, just like with the speech style accommodation, that this idea of abstractness is a clue. There's a reason to believe that this clue should have some connection with what we're trying to get at, but of course we realize that it's a simplification and that we will miss things and that it will be wrong sometimes. And so in order to test whether there was enough of a connection between between the abstractness of words and what we were trying to get at in the posts, we did a face validity check. So the way that we did that was we first used an abstractness dictionary that we were able to get, and we then rated texts based on the average level of abstractness observed in the words in that text based on that lexicon. And then we looked at which words were rated as very abstract or concrete, and also sorted the texts based on this average so that we could look through the ranked list of texts to see if the ranking stands out to us as capturing something about abstractness. So if we would look at the things at one end of that spectrum and look at things at the other end of that spectrum, and it doesn't seem that there's a very stark contrast in terms of displayed cognitive engagement as it seems to us from what we see, then it's probably not a good measure because it's not borne out in what we're seeing in the data. Similarly, those that fall in the middle should show more cognitive engagement as it seems to us from looking at those texts than the ones at the low end, the more concrete end of the scale, but be less than the ones at the very abstract end of the scale. And if what we see is consistent with what we expect, then we believe that this simplification is something that could at least give us an estimate of how much cognitive engagement there is there. So we never would claim that this was a way of really measuring cognitive engagement as it is estimating it. And our face validity check did confirm to us that it was capturing some notion of what we were trying to capture in terms of cognitive engagement. So where we saw a prevalence of words that were high in abstractness, we saw students kind of comparing their ideas in a course and talking about explaining and challenging the kinds of things that you would expect to see when they're engaging in argumentation. And yet on the very concrete end, we saw students telling stories or recounting facts or pointing to details about assignments or what they had to do. And so those were much more concrete. And so you know, obviously we didn't just look at 2 messages, but this was the nature of the process that we engaged in. So once we had that, and I'm not going to talk about a similar effort that we went through in measuring how motivated students seem to be in terms of staying in the course, but we took these measures using a similar methodology paired with face validity checks to then check whether they made predictions about student dropout over time. So we expected that we would see that students who expressed a stronger commitment to the course and also who appeared to be more cognitively engaged with the material would be less likely to drop out. And so we used a survival model to measure the extent to which this prediction was borne out in our data. So let me just explain to you very briefly this representation of the output of a survival model. So a survival model is really like a logistic regression. It's a hierarchical logistic regression, so there are multiple observations per student, one per time point if we have complete data about a student, but sometimes some of those are missing, but those would all be tied together in the model. So it acknowledges that this hierarchical nature and that not all observations in our data set are independent of one another. On the x-axis, we have a measure of time, and that starts with a student's first experience of participation in a course. So it's not the first time point in the course per se, but each student is lined up in terms of where they started. And then on the y-axis, we have the probability that the student will still be active or the student is active at that time point, and we're looking for the pattern over time to show us the probability that students are not still going to be active at the next time point. And so the curve represents the change in probability, how the probability of a student remaining in the course is dropping off over time. So this blue line here represents the population average after we have already factored out those differences that are, you know, in tendencies of behavior per student, and also based on some contextual variables that make consistent predictions for classes of students within the model. So you can see here that there's a pretty steep drop-off, and this is actually very typical of MOOCs that by week 3, most of the students have already dropped out. But the other lines are associated with particular factors that are usually are time variant, things that we can measure about a student at each of these time points, and that make a prediction related over or under the average that you expect of the probability that a student will still be active at the next time point. How is it changed by the fluctuation in that time varying measure? And so in our particular case, what we're really interested in is this average cognitive engagement that I've talked about. Also, I mentioned that we were measuring indicators of commitment or motivation to stay in a course, but we also had some control variables that would say, was this a student who started at the very beginning of the course, which makes a prediction about how committed they are, and also kind of a general indicator of how active they are in the course, which also makes a prediction. So we didn't want those to be confounded with the nature of the contributions that students would make. So what we found, which was consistent with our expectation, is that students who show high average motivation and cognitive engagement drop out of the class at a slower rate. So if a student at a time point expresses over a standard deviation above average of some behavior that we're measuring, so motivation and cognitive engagement in this case, then it's associated with a certain reduction or sometimes increase in their probability of dropout at the next time point, and that's reflected in the hazard ratio here. So hazard ratios of less than 1 indicate a slower drop off or less of a probability of dropout over time, and more steep curves or hazard ratios greater than 1 show that a time varying factor is associated with higher dropout over time. So here we see that students who exhibit low motivation and low cognitive engagement are more likely to drop out. Those who exhibit high motivation and high cognitive engagement are less likely to drop out. And what's interesting here is it just provides us with a way of saying, it makes sense. It sort of validates the idea that we're measuring something that matters, and it's making a prediction for us. So even if it's not perfect, it's the kind of thing that as we measure and students' behavior over time, at a time point, we can get a sense of which students, based on our model, we predict are kind of more vulnerable to dropout. But it's not just for that practical purpose of seeing where the needs are for offering support, but we see that this is an experience that now we have some evidence is valuable for students, not just because we know that cognitive engagement is important for learning, but in this case, we see that it makes a prediction about students staying in a course. Now, we don't know from this model, because it's a correlational model, whether that connection will be causal, but it does give us some impetus to actually test whether if we would provide students with more opportunities for cognitive engagement, would that decrease attrition over time. And so that's been a direction that was suggested by this analysis that we've done and that we've continued to pursue in our work. But we also have looked for generality across multiple MOOCs to get some sense of whether, again, this is just a fluke. Is this just another one of those very shallow indicators that's not very meaningful, that's not really telling us something important about the experience of students? But what we see is that in general, across MOOCs, we see that there's where we see high measures, not measures, but indicators of cognitive engagement and motivation to stay in a course, that we see less dropout predicted at subsequent time points. But what we do see is that which is more valuable, average motivation or average cognitive engagement, depends upon the particular course. And of course, the exact hazard ratios also are varying. And what that tells us is that these measures, there's noise there. There are things, important things that we're not capturing. So we're not fully satisfied with this analysis, and we want to go further. And some of what we've seen really is that the role of those abstractions that students make really vary depending upon the kind of learning activities that are offered in a course and the nature of the material that's being discussed, whether on average it's highly abstract to begin with or highly concrete to begin with, or what is the kind of problem solving, if any, that students are engaging in. And so again, we understand that the language itself is not so easy to get our heads around, that there might be some evidence that we're capturing something valuable, and maybe we can take that and we can move on with it in terms of our design. But at the same time, as we poke further and further, we realize how much we're missing and how much further into the language we should be digging in order to really understand what it is that's happening and what these patterns are really telling us. Nevertheless, we did move on to test some of this in an actual MOOC. And so in a MOOC that was offered last fall, we introduced 2 different interventions to offer more opportunities for collaboration in the context of this MOOC, even though that's not a typical activity that happens in many MOOCs. I'm going to focus on the one that was particularly targeting offering opportunities for cognitive engagement. And that was building on our earlier work in computer-supported collaborative learning. I already mentioned very briefly up front in the talk had been the focus of our research for many years in a classroom context. And we wanted to be able to offer that to students in a MOOC. But actually what's tricky is that the typical MOOC platforms, the very popular ones, they are able to accommodate large numbers of students because they're developed to be highly scalable. And so the architectures themselves are missing some of what would make it easy to get students more aware of who's around and to connect to each other. So in particular, capabilities for instantaneous notifications are really important in order to create social awareness, in order to make it easy for students to find other people to interact with. But these things are missing from every MOOC platform that we know of. And so what do we do about that then? Can we overcome those limitations and still get students talking to each other in real time instead of just in the forums where you post something and you might wait for a very long time before somebody else comes along and responds to your post? So the way that we worked the coordination in this particular first test of this kind of technology was to offer a button that students could click on when they were ready to have a synchronous chat. And what we hoped was there would be enough critical mass from this massive course that at any given time, within a certain small span of time, we would be able to identify another student who came along and also press the button on their side. And so we developed a lobby program where a student, when they clicked, would enter and they would wait until another student came along. And once another student came along, then a chat room was generated automatically for them. They were both given a link and they would click on that link and enter. And once students did that, it was very easy to replicate the experiences that we had offered in a classroom setting in this context. And similar to our classroom studies, students interacted with each other through chat. They were able to share images from the work that they had done individually in the course, and these chats were coordinated by a conversational computer agent that acted as a facilitator. And all of that worked very well once students actually got into these chat rooms. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence that it worked well, but I will say that one problem was that there really wasn't the critical mass that we imagined, that there were so many times that students came and clicked and there just wasn't another student for them to interact with. And so then they either gave up or they came back and tried again, but some students tried many, many times before they finally got matched. And we did find that that was extremely frustrating for students. So I'm going to tell you that there was a positive effect for the students who managed to get matched, but there was also a corresponding negative effect of the frustration from this difficulty in the coordination. But first, let me say that we compared the behavior that we saw in the chats. So these lines that you see that are labeled as bizarre, that's our collaborative framework. That's what's sort of orchestrating these chats between students. And then forums are the discussion forums, those typical edX discussion forums. And then there was also a Twitter stream where students also interacted with one another. So we sampled conversational data from the first 2 weeks of the course from these 3 sources. And we worked to try to get an even sampling that wouldn't be biased by, highly frequently posting students being overrepresented, et cetera, et cetera. So we balanced it. And then we coded that data first for content, where we looked for a difference in terms of whether the students were focusing on just social exchange, discussion about course processes, or topics from the course. And then we also noted for every post whether there was an expressed reasoning from the students. So are they making a mental model about something, whatever was the focus of their message, clear. And then we compared across these 3 settings. And what we found was, in terms of focus on course content, there was a higher concentration both in the Twitter stream and in the chats than in the forums, where the forums really played more of a role of students trying to figure out, how do I find blah, 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 how do I turn something in? They were more about struggles that students had just sort of coping with that edX platform. But then when we looked at reasoning or not, we found that despite the fact that there was a lot of content from the course being discussed in Twitter, it was more for the purpose of posting resources that students might benefit from, and not so much about exchanges of reasoning. And so we saw the highest concentration of reasoning exchange in those chats. And that just really confirms that the chats were providing the opportunities to the MOOC that weren't being offered in other places, and that we were after, that were motivated from our prior work. But we also did a survival model to see if we would find evidence that students benefited from having been matched for chats. And similar to our earlier analysis, we included some control variables so that we wouldn't just have our results confounded by students who put in more effort are the ones who end up in chats and are also the ones who stay in the class longer. So we had control variables to try to account for those effort-related variables, and then we looked at the effect of how many times a student tried to get matched for a chat. And here you can see the hazard ratio is substantially higher than 1, which indicates that the frustration that students experience from these multiple attempts at trying to be matched was associated with higher dropout over time, which is a bad thing. But what we do see here also is, as for the match success, students who got into chats with other students, that there's a substantially lower than 1 hazard ratio, which indicates that having experienced a chat, a student was 56% less likely to drop out at the next time point than if they hadn't experienced a chat. So that's a substantial reduction in dropout over time. And there was also an interaction between those two variables that shows that the negative effect of the frustration was partly mitigated by the positive effect of the match success over and above what was just from the match success itself. So, but not to an extent that really fully counteracted the negative effect of the frustration. So what we see here is we really have to deal with this coordination problem. We tried in a simple way to be able to get students into these chats. We have some evidence that having gotten them into the chats, it was positive for them. They engaged in the behavior that we wanted to see, and we see that associated with a lower dropout at those time points. And yet we have this problem to solve. So in 2 subsequent MOOCs, we have used a more nuanced way of getting students into chats where we don't require that there are 2 students exactly at the same time to be matched, but as soon as a student is ready, they enter into the chat room, the agent comes in, tries to chat them up for a little while, waiting for another student to come in. If another student doesn't come, they get started on the reflection activity by themselves. When another student arrives, they're welcomed in to this ongoing conversation. And so students, as they arrive, can just come in on this rolling basis. We try to minimize the extent to which students are ever sort of exposed to the same topic of conversation more than once. So we try to keep track of those dynamics. And I can talk about those details. Our observation is that this worked much better. There was much less frustration. We didn't see complaints in the discussion forums. But we're waiting to do the survival analysis until we can get the clip data from the 2 MOOCs that we had specifics in. So I will wait for my firm conclusion. Since we are running out of time, I'm going to just very briefly discuss the second activity. But it comes back again to the same idea that what we're trying to achieve is ways of engaging students in transactive exchange, and that there's both a cognitive and a social component to that. And here we're looking at project-based MOOCs, and if you look at typical project-based MOOCs that exist, and really the main MOOC platform that offers these experiences to students is NovoEd, and they've done a great job of being sort of the first platform to offer these experiences to students. And yet, if you look, you'll see that the majority of student projects fail. And why are they failing? Well, we have been doing some analysis of what's going on in those groups, and we're convinced that a big part of the problem actually is how the students are getting into their teams in the first place, that there was room for research that would make that formation of team process more effective. And so you'll remember when we talked about the theoretical foundation of transactive knowledge exchange, there was this idea of a balance of power or mutual respect that we expected between students. And so what we're going to do is try to leverage that idea that if we can identify which students will have those attitudes towards one another and put them in groups together, that they'll engage in more transactive knowledge exchange within their groups, and that will make their projects more successful. So based on this idea, we developed a deliberation-based team formation strategy, where the idea is to try to maintain a connection between students in their groups, but also the whole community that offers them intellectual and support resources beyond what they can get from just their team. And we delay the team formation so that students don't have to pick a team right when they come into a course, but they're going to engage in a meaningful part of the project in that whole class context first, so that they have an experience of the community before they get into their groups. And then we will look at the processes that they engaged in with different students in that whole community setting before they get assigned to groups, so that we can find those students who they have more of a tendency to engage in transactive exchanges with. And where we believe that if students are differentially engaged in transactive knowledge exchange within the whole community, that those students who they have had those exchanges with in the past will be the ones that they will work together with best in their teams. And again, that's based on this whole idea of transactivity and its social and cognitive underpinnings. So we set up a paradigm in Mechanical Turk to first test out these ideas. And we, because these studies were successful, are now going to implement these in 2 different MOOCs to test them in a more realistic setting. But in the MTurk setting, we were able to separately test whether there was value in having students engage in part of the project in the whole community before being assigned to their teams, and also this way of assigning teams based on observed pairwise transactive exchange in the discussion forums. And so we developed a task where first students are individually instructed in one of 4 kinds of energy, because what they're going to do in their team project is come together and develop an integrated energy plan for a city. So they have differential knowledge, and then based on their differential knowledge, they come up with a proposal that's really kind of skewed towards what they're capable of achieving by themselves. Then they post this to the discussion forum, where the task at that stage is for students to give each other feedback, substantive feedback from their perspective on the other students' proposals. And then from that, they're assigned to groups, and in their groups, they work on a more complicated city situation that they have to put together a joint energy plan about. Now, we have a choice in the way that this is assigned, and where in time does the grouping take place. So it could happen, for example, that after students complete the pre-task, they're assigned to teams based just on this jigsaw, and that they do this deliberation stage in their small group, and then in that same small group, they develop the joint energy plan. Or they can engage as a whole community in this deliberation process, and the assignment to teams can take place after that, and then the only thing that they do only in their group is that integrated energy plan. So one study was to compare these 2 different paths towards getting into teams. A second study looked at whether we used evidence from how students were interacting with each other in the deliberation phase, with the assumption that everyone does that at the whole community setting. If we used the automatically measured transactivity between students during this as a way of doing the assignment, do we get better teams than if we randomly assign teams? So of course we had to do several batches in order to be able to test all of these things. But in MTurk, it's possible to do that. So even though that's not a MOOC itself, we were able to isolate the variables of interest here, and we can then identify whether it's worth trying to do this in a MOOC context. And the results were very striking. We found both of those contrasts were significant. So students benefited more from doing that feedback stage in the whole community, and then only doing the integrated proposal in their teams. And the impact in terms of how well integrated the proposals were, how they reflected an integration of different perspectives. That's what we were measuring. It was a significant effect of 3 standard deviations. And then in a second study, we were then comparing. Everyone in that second study had the benefit of the whole community for the feedback stage prior to doing the integrated proposals within groups. But in one condition, we randomly assigned students to those teams. And in the other, it was based on observed transactivity. In both cases, we made sure that every team had the full jigsaw, so all 4 energies were always present in these groups. And again, we find, though, the transactivity-based team assignment led to a 3 standard deviation effect. So 2 3 standard deviation effects on top of each other gives us an indication that even though this MTurk environment is, arguably not a real MOOC, there's a reason to try now to take this paradigm and implement it in a MOOC. So we're going to work with Stanford on their statistics course to integrate this into where they have now 2 kinds of problems, sort of more scaffolded focused problems and sort of slightly more open-ended data analytics problems. We're going to add a third, far more open-ended exploratory problem, and then we're going to use the second ones as our pre-task, where students in the whole community will give each other feedback and talk together, reflecting on this slightly open-ended task, and then from that we will assign them to teams and they will work together on more exploratory tasks. And in a superheroes course that's being offered through the Smithsonian, the team project is developing an analysis of designed superheroes and how they interact with each other in a historical context. And this will be after students create their own superhero and talk about, give each other feedback on that. And where designing a superhero sounds like a frivolous activity, but really is a reflection of a student's understanding of history and how people use literature to be able to grapple with issues that are of concern from a social perspective during a period of time. Okay, so just very briefly, I just want to say we're developing resources to be able to support this research. We're building some community around this. Come to our website, dance.cs.cmu.edu. We have a monthly talk series. We're offering some technology for supporting analytics of discourse, but also supportive discourse in online courses. And I hope I've convinced you that language is a beautiful thing and that you really want to dig in and learn more about it. And I'll just open for questions.
I was wondering about your inventions. They are a subject contact, or are they for, especially the second one, is for elementary and secondary students?
Oh, okay. So what age group?
Yeah.
So in a classroom context, we have worked with middle school, high school, college age students. In the MOOC context, it's mainly adult learning.
Okay.
So
college students?
They might be undergraduate students or older. Other questions?
And I also have a question about the effect size, 3 standard deviation. That sounds very large, kind of the 2 ends of the...
We were shocked too. So I really thought that we must have done the analysis wrong. I went back and I redid the analysis that my student did, and it really was 3 standard deviations. So so maybe I should say a little bit more about what it was that we were counting. So the score for the integrated proposal would look for how many times did students talk about a trade-off between 2 proposed energies, and what would be the difference in terms of implications. And they lost points if they made an incorrect claim, or if they said, well, so they didn't get credit if they mentioned an idea in support of an energy plan, but that it didn't actually connect to somebody else's energy plan. So, for example, if a student argued, but so let's say they got into their group, but there was one really smart student, and that student wrote the whole energy plan from that student's perspective, not listening to anybody else, but it was beautifully argued. That student would not get very many points, because even though there was a lot of argumentation, it wasn't showing that it was an integration of perspectives. So we were really grading the integration of perspectives. And so the reason why we think that both manipulations had such a strong effect is, first, students, if they do the feedback in the whole community, have exposure to many more perspectives. So they just have a larger pool to draw from when they're doing their integrated proposal. So it's not really surprising then that feedback just in your group, where you only have your teammates to give you feedback, it just doesn't give you access to the intellectual resources that you would have if that discussion had happened in the whole community level. On the transactivity aspect, I think what we're seeing there is that we're grouping students together who are used to building on each other's ideas. And so when they get into their team, they continue behaving that way together. And so then it's more likely that the product will show that they engaged in those processes together. So then you could say, again, not so surprising that we see that effect, because we were really setting up for that effect. So yeah, maybe then it's not so mysterious. And yet what it shows is that there is a way of achieving that, because what we really want to do is help students find a team where they're going to be able to benefit from the interaction. And since we have evidence from decades of studies of collaborative learning that this kind of exchange is what makes those collaborative activities effective, if we can find a way in a MOOC context to give students those opportunities by helping them find the students that they can interact with that way, then even if it's not mysterious, it's still a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering about like the maximizing interactivity.
Yeah.
I guess my intuition would have been that they're kind of like highly interactive people and then very non-interactive people. And so, but it feels like to me you're suggesting maybe in these big groups there are pods that sort of naturally form.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to figure out how that works. Like,
how did that work? Yeah, that's an excellent question. We actually were worried about that. So what we used to do the grouping was what's called a max cost flow algorithm. It's an approximate constraint satisfaction algorithm. So we can tell it, if we had done the search, so one of my students said if we had done an exhaustive search of all of the ways of pairing students to try to maximize within team average pairwise transactivity exchange, it would have taken 3 years to run the program. But we could run this in milliseconds, and it doesn't give you the perfect solution, but apparently it was good enough. What we worried about though was that, it really is that some students are just better at argumentation than others. And those students, regardless of what team they're in, will increase the quality of the integration that you see in the results. And other students are just poor at this. And some of the teams are going to be high and some of the teams are going to be low. And so in order to check to see whether something like that was occurring, what we would do is in each batch that we ran for the study, we would look in the discussion forum at, average for that discussion forum, how much transactivity do we see, regardless of who did it and who it was aimed at. And we do not see differences between batches for the average amount of transactivity. But then after we did the maximization to do the assignment and we compared those teams, average within team pairwise transactivity with the other teams, we see significantly more transactivity at this level in the teams where we did the assignment. What that shows a way of doing the matching that, at least based on the evidence you see here, was measurably better. So that shows that students talked differently depending upon who they were talking to, even here. So I'm sure it was also the case that there are some students that are just better at doing that behavior. But within these different batches, we had the same level of variation across students. But it was distributed in such a way that we were able to make teams where, when we compare teams and teams, populations of teams, we see that the maximization is able to get that average pairwise transactivity exchange to be higher. So it didn't have to be true. It ended up being true only because of the way it's distributed. So, and what I think is that really reinforces the idea that there's a skill involved in engaging in transactive display, but there's a social element too. You have to be with the people who you feel comfortable with, that you respect enough, that you feel like you have something to offer, but you also want to listen to them, because that's what's reflected in these transactive contributions. And so because of that social element, there's something to be leveraged by this algorithm. If that wasn't true, I think it wouldn't have worked, and it would have been what you said. And there's always a person who asks that question every time I talk about this result. Other questions? Yes.
I have one more question. It's very, oh, sorry.
That's okay.
You found out that cognitive engagement and motivation are significant to predict their status in 7 weeks, the student nutrition.
Yeah, at least the rate, so a measurement at a time point says something about the likelihood that they'll still be in at the next time
So
point.
in the first intervention, that's the pairing of students in chat. Does that improve student cognitive engagement? Because in my experience, I have chat setting in my online courses, but I found my students don't use that to talk about like course content. They talk about something else, like, oh, I need a presentation of my group, something like that. So how did you have any guidance or monitoring for students?
Okay, so I think it's important to note that we didn't just put students in chat rooms and just leave them to talk. We gave them something to do in that. It was a collaborative reflection. And there was a computer agent that was the facilitator structuring the activity and guiding students towards that collaborative reflection. And then we checked to see if that's the behavior that we would get. That's what I was mentioning here, where we were looking at text that we got from the chats in comparison to what we see in the discussion forums, in comparison to what we see in Twitter.
Did you see an improvement in cognitive engagement, like you measured with the words?
Okay, so what we did, actually, this analysis was all done by hand. So we extracted the some sampling of text from these different contexts, and then by hand we assigned labels for reasoning is being displayed or not. And so reasoning being displayed was our cognitive engagement indicator here, because that was really what we were trying to capture indirectly through our abstractness measure in the previous analysis. But here, it was actually literally somebody by hand identifying this displays reasoning versus not. So we even believe this more. And so then comparing across the context, we see a higher concentration of expressed cognitive engagement.
Okay. Next time I will give some assignments.
Yeah, it's important to note also that these activities were well integrated with the material in each unit, and that every unit followed the same paradigm. So students would do some individual learning, and then they would come into the chat to talk to each other about what they had learned. And they were told that that was the expectation. And so again, it wasn't just that there's this chat room. I think it's not the case necessarily that just offering the opportunity to have a chat would have given the opportunity or the increase the propensity to engage in these behaviors, but that was what the assignment was. This was really just a manipulation check. Did students actually do what we asked them to do? Because maybe they wouldn't, they could have just played around, but thankfully they did not.
So
Yes.
if I'm going to stop because we've got to go, and I know people have set times. But Dr. Rose is going to be available about 3:30 in the lounge. So if folks have more questions for her, please come see us there. Thank you, everyone, for coming.